In 1990, a fatal helicopter crash silenced a 35-year-old force of nature just as he finally conquered his darkest demons. Born into the terror of a violently abusive Dallas home, Stevie Ray Vaughan used a battered guitar to scream when fear stole his voice. He survived years of starvation in Austin dive bars, forging a heavy, bleeding sound that forced the original blues legends to bow. When a lethal cocaine addiction threatened to rot him from the inside out, he fought back by striking his thick steel strings with the furious, unrelenting power of a hurricane. Though his physical life was cut brutally short, his thunderous legacy remains an untamed, roaring tempest that forever altered the landscape of American music. Stevie Ray Vaughan was born on October 3, 1954. He arrived in a world that was already vibrating with tension. His father, Jimmy Lee Vaughan, known to everyone as Big Jim, was a veteran of the Second World War. He returned from the Pacific Theater not with glory, but with the invisible, corrosive trauma that defined a generation of men who were told to simply get to work and suppress their nightmares. Big Jim found employment as an asbestos worker. It was brutal, toxic labor. He spent his days in the suffocating heat of Texas, inhaling fibers that would eventually destroy his lungs, trading his physical health for a meager paycheck. This systemic crushing of the working-class male ego bred a specific kind of domestic tyrant. Big Jim was a severe, unpredictable alcoholic. He did not drink to relax. He drank to anesthetize a deep, simmering rage. When the alcohol took over, the frustration of his dead-end life erupted into violence. He ruled his home with absolute terror. A misplaced object, a sudden noise, or a perceived slight could trigger an explosive physical assault. For Stevie and his older brother, Jimmy, childhood was a daily exercise in threat assessment. They learned to read the sound of their father's truck pulling into the driveway. They learned to gauge the heaviness of his footsteps on the porch. If the steps were irregular, they knew the alcohol was in his bloodstream. They knew it would disappear. The trauma of this environment manifested differently in the two brothers. Jimmy, 3 years older, developed a tough exterior. He became defiant. He fought back, which often drew the brunt of Big Jim's wrath. Stevie, however, internalized the terror. He was naturally small, physically frail, and profoundly sensitive. The violence in his home terrified him into submission. He developed a severe stutter. He struggled to look people in the eye. He became a ghost in his own house, trying to shrink himself down to a size where he would not be noticed and therefore not be hit. He lived in a state of hypervigilance, his nervous system constantly redlined. This is the root of the Texas hurricane. When a human being is stripped of their voice by fear, that energy does not simply vanish. It ferments. It builds pressure. It looks for a crack in the concrete to escape. For Stevie, that crack appeared in the form of his older brother. Jimmy Vaughan was everything Stevie wanted to be: brave, rebellious, and effortlessly cool. Stevie idolized him with absolute blind devotion. He wore Jimmy's cast-off clothes. He mimicked his walk. And crucially, he watched Jimmy discover music. Jimmy was a natural musician, picking up the guitar and quickly establishing himself in local Dallas garage bands. To Stevie, Jimmy's guitar was not just an instrument, it was a shield. When Jimmy played, the house changed. The music was loud enough to drown out the shouting. It commanded attention. It demanded space in a home where space was dictated entirely by their father's rage. When Stevie was 7 years old, Jimmy discarded a cheap plastic toy guitar. It had only 3 strings. For most children, it would have been a disposable plaything. For Stevie, it was a lifeline. He picked it up and refused to let it go. He carried it around the house like a security blanket. He plucked at the 3 strings, trying to imitate the sounds he heard his brother making. A year later, Jimmy outgrew his first real instrument, a battered acoustic flat top, and handed it down to Stevie. The moment Stevie wrapped his small hands around the wooden neck and pressed his fingers into the steel strings, a permanent psychological shift occurred. The steel strings cut into his soft fingertips, causing them to blister and bleed, but he did not care. The physical pain of playing the guitar was something he could control. It was a stark contrast to the unpredictable, terrifying pain inflicted by his father. Stevie did not learn to play the guitar the way most musicians do. He never took a formal lesson. He never learned to read a single note of sheet music. Music theory, scales, and structured education felt like the rigid, authoritarian control he was trying to escape. Instead, he learned through a method of obsessive, punishing repetition. He retreated to his small bedroom, shut the door, and turned on a cheap record player. He raided Jimmy's record collection. He discovered the titans of the blues, Muddy Waters, Otis Rush, Buddy Guy, Albert King, and Jimi Hendrix. These were men who had also been marginalized, abused, and forced to the bottom of the American social hierarchy. They did not play music to entertain. They played to survive. Their music was raw, bleeding, and stripped of all pretense. Stevie recognized the pain in their voices and the weeping of their guitars. It was a language he instinctively understood. His learning process was an exercise in extreme discipline. He would drop the needle onto a vinyl record, listen to a 2-second phrase played by Albert King, and lift the needle. He would then sit on his bed and search the fretboard of his guitar until he found the exact notes. He didn't just want to find the pitch, he wanted to find the tone. He wanted to mimic the aggressive snap of the string, the microtonal bend, the heavy vibrato that sounded like a human sob. Once he mastered those 2 seconds, he dropped the needle again. He did this for hours, days, and years. He wore the grooves out of the vinyl records until they were unplayable. By the time he was a young teenager, a profound transformation had taken place. The stuttering, terrified boy from Tyler Street had developed a voice of startling power. He still struggled to speak, but when he plugged an electric guitar into an amplifier, he was articulate, furious, and commanding. The guitar became a physical extension of his body. It was his method of processing trauma. Every bent string was a scream he was never allowed to release. Every aggressive chord was a punch he could never throw at his father. He began playing in local Dallas bands, the Shantones, the Brooklyn Underground, the Nightcrawlers. He was underage, sneaking into dive bars to play sets that stretched late into the night. The club owners didn't care about his age. They only cared that the skinny kid could play the blues with the authority of a 50-year-old Delta veteran. But as his talent grew, so did his friction with the world outside of music. High school felt like a prison. The structured environment of classrooms and authority figures triggered his deep-seated anxieties. Furthermore, Dallas in the early 1970s was a conservative, rigid city. The local music scene was dominated by polite country music and top 40 cover bands. The raw, aggressive blues that Stevie was cultivating had no real audience there. The tension at home also reached a breaking point. Big Jim's alcoholism had not abated. The violence was still a reality. Jimmy had already left the house, leaving Stevie alone to navigate the minefield. The safety Stevie felt was only present when the amplifier was turned on. The moment he unplugged, the terror returned. By 1971, Stevie was 17. He looked at his father, broken by asbestos and alcohol. He looked at the high school he despised. He realized with cold clarity that if he stayed in Dallas, the environment would eventually kill him, either physically or spiritually. The survival instinct that had driven him to master the guitar now demanded that he run. He packed a few changes of clothes, grabbed his guitar, and walked away from the house on Tyler Street. He did not have a plan, a safety net, or a high school diploma. He jumped into the passenger seat of a friend's truck and looked south toward a city where the rules were different. He was heading to Austin. In 1972, Austin, Texas, was a geographic anomaly. It was a liberal oasis surrounded by a desert of rigid Southern conservatism. While Dallas was defined by oil money, strict social hierarchies, and the looming shadows of corporate skyscrapers, Austin was defined by cheap rent, cold beer, and a fiercely independent counterculture. It was a collision zone where cosmic cowboys, disenfranchised hippies, and outlaw musicians bled into one another. For a 17-year-old runaway with no high school diploma and a history of domestic trauma, Austin was not just a destination. It was an asylum. Stevie Ray Vaughan arrived in this chaotic environment with nothing but the clothes on his back and the guitar in his hand. He had successfully escaped the physical violence of his father, but the psychological scars were packed in his luggage. Freedom, he quickly learned, possessed its own kind of brutality. The romanticized myth of the starving artist is a lie sold by people who have never actually starved. The reality of Stevie's life in Austin during the early 1970s was an exercise in extreme, degrading poverty. He was a genuine hobo. He had no apartment, no bank account, and no safety net. He survived by sleeping on the hardwood floors of drafty rehearsal spaces, using his guitar case as a pillow. When those spaces were locked, he crashed on the couches of whatever musicians would tolerate him, often waking up to the smell of stale beer and overflowing ashtrays. He ate whatever was left on the plates at local diners, or survived on a diet of cheap fast food bought with handfuls of change collected from recycling empty glass bottles. He played in dilapidated roadhouses and dive bars where the chicken wire was sometimes strung across the stage to protect the band from flying beer bottles. His payment for a blistering 3-hour set was rarely cash. It was usually a few free drinks and whatever tips the drunken patrons threw into a jar. Yet, he endured this staggering physical deprivation without complaint. Why? Because to Stevie, physical hunger was manageable. It was a transaction he was willing to make. He was starving his body, but for the first time in his life, he was feeding his soul. The floor of a dirty Austin rehearsal room was infinitely safer than a clean bed in a house ruled by a violent alcoholic. Poverty was the price of his independence, and he paid it gladly. He threw himself into the local music scene, playing with anyone who would let him plug in his amplifier. He eventually found a steady gig with a popular local blues rock outfit called Paul Ray and the Cobras. The Cobras were a working-class band, grinding out sets in venues like the Soap Creek Saloon. This period is crucial to understanding the architecture of Stevie's psychology. Despite possessing a generational, terrifying level of talent on the guitar, he flatly refused to take the center stage. Paul Ray was the frontman, the man who held the microphone, told the jokes, and engaged the audience. Stevie stood firmly in the shadows, off to the side, his head bowed, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He was hiding. He was hiding. The deep-seated anxieties of his Dallas childhood still dictated his actions off stage. Standing in front of a microphone required vulnerability. It required a voice. Stevie was convinced his singing voice was weak and unacceptable. Furthermore, being the frontman meant being the target of the audience's scrutiny. If a show went poorly, the frontman took the blame. By hiding in the rhythm section, Stevie insulated himself from failure. He could let Paul Ray take the heat of the spotlight while he communicated entirely through his hands. He was a sniper firing from the safety of the dark. He provided the explosive firepower that made the Cobras a local phenomenon, but he maintained the psychological safety of a sideman. However, the ceiling for a local Austin bar band was low. The crowds were rough, the pay was abysmal, and the music industry at large ignored Texas entirely. But the local landscape shifted seismically in the mid-1970s, not because of a record executive, but because of a local visionary named Clifford Antone. Clifford Antone was a heavy, intimidating figure with deep ties to the Austin underworld, but his true religion was the blues. In 1975, he opened Antone's, a nightclub on 6th Street. Antone's was not designed to be a profitable pop venue. It was designed to be a sanctuary, a preservation site for a genre of music that the mainstream had largely discarded. Clifford Antone used his money and his formidable street influence to fly the original architects of the Chicago and Delta blues down to Texas. Suddenly, the absolute titans of the genre, Muddy Waters, Buddy Guy, Otis Rush, Hubert Sumlin, and Albert King, were walking through the doors of a club in Central Texas. For Stevie Ray Vaughan, Antone's club was not a bar. It was a university. It was the Mecca he had been searching for since he first dropped a needle on a vinyl record in his childhood bedroom. Stevie practically lived at Antone's. He was there every single night, standing at the edge of the stage, watching the men who had invented the vocabulary he spoke. Clifford Antone recognized the freakish, undeniable brilliance of the quiet, skinny white kid hovering in the corners of his club. Antone took on a role that Big Jim Vaughan had abandoned. He became a protector, a patron, and a surrogate father figure to Stevie. Recognizing that Stevie needed to be tested by the fire, Antone began demanding that the visiting blues legends let the local kids sit in on their sets. The racial and generational dynamics of these moments were intensely complex. The men headlining Antone's were older black musicians who had survived the Jim Crow South, poverty, and decades of systemic exploitation by the music industry. They were notoriously protective of their music and deeply skeptical of young, flashy white guitarists who wanted to co-opt their pain for a rock and roll aesthetic. When this frail, soft-spoken 20-something kid stepped onto their stage, they expected a mimic, they expected a tourist. What they got was a revelation. When Stevie plugged in, he didn't just play their licks, he matched their intensity. The blues is not a genre defined by technical speed or complex music theory. It is an autopsy of the working-class soul. It requires the musician to strip away all pretense and expose their deepest wounds to the audience. You cannot fake the blues. The old masters listened to the violence in Stevie's right hand, the desperate, weeping vibrato in his left, and they immediately recognized the authenticity of his suffering. Whether or not they knew his personal history, they heard an undeniable, raw authenticity in his playing. His relentless intensity bridged the gap of race, age, and geography, leading them to accept him not as a fan, but as a peer. The most profound and transformative of these relationships was with Albert King. Albert King was a colossal man, standing 6'4", usually smoking a pipe, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. He played a Gibson Flying V guitar upside down and left-handed, utilizing strange, unorthodox tunings. King was infamous for his fierce temper and his utter intolerance for mediocre musicians. He did not suffer fools, and he rarely shared his stage. When Clifford Antone first pressured King to let Stevie sit in, King was dismissive. He looked at the scrawny kid and grumbled, expecting to humiliate him and send him packing. But as the jam session began, King's demeanor shifted. He threw complex, heavily syncopated rhythm changes at Stevie, trying to lose him. Stevie locked in, matching him beat for beat. Then King launched into a blistering solo, daring the kid to respond. Stevie did not back down. He fired back with a tone so massive and a phrasing so aggressive that King actually stopped playing, stepped back from the microphone, and stared at the young guitarist in profound shock. From that night forward, a unique mentor-mentee bond was forged. Albert King saw a successor. He took Stevie under his wing in a way he had never done for any other musician. He stood next to Stevie on the stage of Antone's and delivered masterclasses in real time. King's signature technique was the string bend. He didn't just push the string slightly to alter the pitch. He would hook his massive fingers under the steel and drag it across the fretboard, stretching the note to its absolute physical breaking point before letting it snap back into place. It was a technique that mimicked the wail of a human voice in agony. King taught Stevie the mechanics of this violence. He showed him how to use the entire weight of his forearm to manipulate the heavy strings. He taught him that the spaces between the notes, the silence, were just as important as the notes themselves. He taught him how to squeeze a single note until it bled, proving that one perfectly placed, emotionally devastating bend was worth more than 1,000 rapid-fire scales. Stevie absorbed this like a sponge. He took the soulful, crying bends of Albert King, combined them with the chaotic, distorted fire of Jimi Hendrix and the relentless driving rhythm of Texas roadhouses. He was forging a hybrid style of guitar playing that the world had never seen. It was feral. It was hyper-masculine in its power, yet deeply vulnerable in its emotional delivery. By the late 1970s, the apprenticeship at Antone's was complete. The kid who had arrived in Austin sleeping on pool tables had absorbed the collective knowledge of the blues masters. He had the weapon, he had the vocabulary, but he was still hiding in the shadows of the rhythm section. He was still terrified of his own voice. The music industry was about to force his hand, stripping away his hiding places and pushing him toward a microphone he desperately wanted to avoid. The hobo was about to become a frontman, whether he was ready for it or not. The psychological safety of the shadows is a difficult addiction to break. By 1977, Stevie Ray Vaughan had accumulated an arsenal of musical weaponry that rivaled any living guitar player on the planet. He had absorbed the weeping bends of Albert King, the rhythmic ferocity of Texas roadhouses, and the distorted, chaotic fire of Jimi Hendrix. Yet he remained fundamentally terrified of his own voice. He was playing in a group called the Triple Threat Review, a band that featured W.C. Clark on bass and a powerhouse vocalist named Lou Ann Barton. Barton was a force of nature, loud, brash, and commanding. She was the lightning rod that absorbed the crowd's attention, allowing Stevie to do what he had done since childhood: hide. When you play the guitar, you can hide behind the wood and the wire. The instrument acts as a translator, filtering your pain and projecting it outward while keeping your physical self insulated. But singing is a naked act. It requires you to step to the edge of the stage, open your mouth, and offer your unvarnished self to the judgment of strangers. For a man who grew up with a severe stutter, in a house where speaking up often resulted in a physical beating from an alcoholic father, the microphone was an object of absolute terror. In 1978, the safety net vanished. Lou Ann Barton abruptly quit the band to pursue a solo career. The remaining members were left with a slate of booked gigs and no frontman. The departure forced Stevie into a corner where his survival instinct had to override his trauma. There was no money to hire a new singer. If the band canceled their gigs, they would starve. Stevie had to step up to the microphone. The first few nights were an exercise in sheer anxiety. He stood at the center of the stage, his eyes squeezed shut, his head angled downward, singing with a rough nasal baritone that he privately despised. But a profound shift occurred in the friction of that discomfort. Because he lacked the smooth, polished vocal range of a traditional soul singer, he had to sing the only way he knew how, with desperate, unpolished honesty. His voice sounded exactly like his guitar playing, strained, urgent, and bruised. He renamed the band Double Trouble, drawing inspiration from an old Otis Spann record, and he began the painful process of dismantling his own invisibility. To build the foundation he needed to front the band, Stevie required a rhythm section of immovable density. He recruited a drummer named Chris Layton, whose metronomic precision and jazz-inflected swing provided the perfect counterweight to Stevie's erratic, unpredictable solos. Stevie laid the initial groundwork with drummer Chris Layton and bassist Jackie Newhouse, but the definitive trinity was only forged later, in 1981, when a seasoned bass player named Tommy Shannon stepped into the picture. Tommy Shannon was not a rookie. He had played at Woodstock with Johnny Winter. He had tasted the heights of the music industry and had subsequently crashed back down, battling his own severe demons and addictions. When Shannon walked into an Austin club and saw Stevie Ray Vaughan playing a battered Stratocaster, the connection was immediate and visceral. Shannon recognized a fellow survivor. When Shannon joined Double Trouble, he didn't just provide a bass line, he provided a concrete floor. The chemistry between the three men was telepathic. Layton and Shannon locked together to form a massive, relentless wall of sound, freeing Stevie from the responsibility of carrying the rhythm. He could launch himself off that concrete floor, take the guitar into wild, chaotic stratospheres of improvisation, and know exactly where the ground would be when he came back down. Double Trouble became a regional juggernaut. They dominated the sweaty, smoke-choked roadhouses of Texas. But dominating Texas in the late 1970s and early 1980s was a commercial dead end. The music industry at large had declared the blues a dead language. The major record labels in New York and Los Angeles were funneling their money into the slick, synthesized sounds of new wave, the four-on-the-floor beats of disco, and the polished theatricality of arena rock. A trio from Austin playing loud, aggressive 12-bar blues was viewed as an archaic dinosaur. A&R representatives refused to travel to Texas to see them. Record executives dismissed their demo tapes. Stevie, Chris, and Tommy were stuck in a brutal, exhausting cycle. They were driving hundreds of miles a day in a cramped, un-air-conditioned van, hauling their own heavy amplifiers into dive bars, playing 3-hour sets of grueling, physical music, and making just enough money to put gas in the tank and buy cheap food. The ceiling was low and it felt unbreakable. But authenticity possesses a gravity that eventually pulls the right people into its orbit. Enter Jerry Wexler. Jerry Wexler was an industry titan, the legendary producer at Atlantic Records who had shaped the careers of Aretha Franklin and Ray Charles. He was a man who understood the architecture of the human soul. He was attending a record release party in Texas when he caught a set by Double Trouble. Wexler was instantly paralyzed by what he heard. He recognized that Stevie was not playing a revival act. He was playing a living, breathing, dangerous form of the blues. Wexler bypassed the traditional conservative A&R departments. He used his massive industry leverage to strong-arm the organizers of the Montreux Jazz Festival in Switzerland, demanding they put this unknown Texas bar band on the bill. In July 1982, Stevie Ray Vaughan and Double Trouble became the first unsigned act in history to play the prestigious Montreux Jazz Festival. It was meant to be their coronation. It turned into a psychological execution. To understand the disaster of Montreux, you must understand the environment. The Montreux Jazz Festival in 1982 was an upscale, refined affair. The audience consisted of wealthy European purists who treated the blues as a delicate museum artifact. They wanted older acoustic musicians sitting on stools, playing polite, quiet, historically accurate renditions of Delta standards. They wanted background music for their wine. Into this quiet, polite atmosphere walked a trio of exhausted, gritty Texans. Stevie, clad in a wide-brimmed hat and boots, dragged a wall of massive Fender amplifiers onto the stage of the Montreux Casino. They did not sit on stools. They plugged in, turned the amplifiers to the point of distortion, and launched into Texas Flood with the subtlety of a freight train driving through a living room. The sheer sonic force hit the European audience like a physical assault. The volume was deafening. The aggressive, physical nature of Stevie's playing was entirely foreign to a crowd that expected restraint, and the crowd revolted. They began to whistle. In European crowds, whistling is the equivalent of a vicious, coordinated booing. The whistling grew louder, cutting through the heavy amplifiers. They yelled insults. They jeered. For a man whose entire psychological framework was built on a foundation of childhood trauma and a deep, terrifying lack of self-worth, the sound of an entire arena rejecting him was devastating. The boos hit Stevie like physical blows. Every insecurity he had ever harbored, that he was a fraud, that his voice was ugly, that the ghost of his father was right about him being worthless, was amplified and broadcast back to him by the audience. He did not stop playing. He finished the set, driving his fingers into the heavy strings with an angry, desperate intensity, but the damage was done. The moment the final chord rang out, Stevie unplugged his guitar, walked off the stage, and disappeared into the backstage dressing room. He collapsed into a chair and buried his face in his hands. He wept. His eyes were red and swollen. He looked at his bandmates and told them it was over. He had been given one singular chance to break out of the Texas bar circuit, one chance to prove to the world that his music had value, and the world had spit it back in his face. But history is rarely decided by the loudest voices in the room. While the purists in the audience booed, a handful of musicians standing in the dark wings of the stage were experiencing a completely different reality. David Bowie, who was currently in the process of reinventing pop music for the 1980s, was standing backstage. Bowie did not care about the rules of acoustic blues. He cared about raw, alien, undeniable energy. He had watched Stevie's set with his jaw slack. He saw a guitarist playing with a feral intensity that could not be manufactured in a studio. As Stevie sat in the dressing room, devastated and defeated, Bowie walked in. He did not offer condolences for the crowd's reaction. He ignored it entirely. He looked at Stevie and immediately offered him the role of lead guitarist on his upcoming studio album, Let's Dance. It was an offer to step onto the biggest pop stage on Earth. Seconds later, the dressing room door opened again. Jackson Browne, the superstar Californian singer-songwriter, walked in. Browne had also been watching from the wings, equally mesmerized by the violent beauty of Stevie's tone. Browne understood the brutal economics of being an unsigned band. He knew they couldn't afford to capture that sound in a high-end facility. Browne made a blunt, life-altering proposition. He owned a private recording studio in Los Angeles called Downtown Studio. He told Stevie, Chris, and Tommy that the studio was theirs, completely free of charge, for 3 days over the upcoming Thanksgiving weekend. In the span of 30 minutes, Stevie Ray Vaughan had experienced the most public, humiliating rejection of his life, followed immediately by the validation of two of the most successful artists in the world. In November 1982, Double Trouble drove their beat-up van from Texas to Los Angeles. They walked into Jackson Browne's downtown studio. They had no major label budget, no slick producer, and no time to experiment. They had 72 hours to capture lightning in a bottle. They set the studio up exactly like they set up on a club stage. They placed the amplifiers in a circle. They didn't isolate the drums in a separate room. They let the sound bleed into the microphones. They hit the record button and played a live set. There was no overdubbing, no digital correction, and almost no second takes. Stevie sang the vocals while playing the rhythm and lead parts simultaneously. They played with the urgent, desperate energy of men who knew this might be their only shot to document their existence. In 3 days, they recorded the entirety of their debut album, Texas Flood. Legendary talent scout John Hammond, the man who had discovered Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen, heard the raw tapes. Hammond brought them to Epic Records, and the label signed the band. When Texas Flood was released in 1983, it dropped like a bomb on the synthetic drum, machine-dominated landscape of 1980s music. It was a massive, unexpected commercial triumph. It proved that a market still existed for visceral, unpolished human emotion. The hobo from Austin was now an international star, but the machinery of fame is a meat grinder. The success of Texas Flood demanded endless touring, immediate studio follow-ups, and a life lived entirely on the road. The pressure was mounting, and the trauma that Stevie had suppressed with his guitar was beginning to leak out. To sustain the furious physical demands of his new reality, he would turn to a chemical armor that would exact a terrifying, nearly fatal toll on his body and his mind. The paradox of sudden, massive success is that it does not erase childhood trauma. It merely provides the financial resources to anesthetize it with terrifying efficiency. When Texas Flood hit the international market in 1983, Stevie Ray Vaughan was thrust into a grueling, high-stakes industrial machine. The music business in the 1980s was an unforgiving apparatus designed to extract maximum profit from its artists. There was no time allocated for psychological adjustment. The transition from starving on the floor of an Austin rehearsal space to headlining global tours happened with a violent whiplash. Stevie was expected to perform, grant interviews, record follow-up albums, and act as the savior of the blues, all while still possessing the nervous system of the terrified, stuttering boy from Dallas. To survive the crushing expectations of this new reality, he relied on two mechanisms. The first was his guitar. The second was a chemical armor that would nearly kill him. To truly comprehend the depth of Stevie's internal struggle during this era, one must examine the brutal physical mechanics of how he played his instrument. He did not play the guitar. He engaged in a nightly physical war with it. The electric guitar is typically an instrument of finesse, especially in the realm of 1980s rock, where musicians heavily favored extremely thin strings, usually a size 9 or 10 gauge. Thin strings require minimal finger pressure, allowing for effortless, lightning-fast scales and easy string bending. Stevie outright rejected this standard. He strung his Fender Stratocaster with heavy-gauge strings, starting at a massive size 13 and ending with a 58 or 60 on the low end. These are cables typically reserved for heavy acoustic guitars or jazz hollow bodies. The physical strength required to press a size 13 steel string down to the fretboard is immense. The force required to catch that string with a single finger and bend it a full step and a half across the neck is staggering. It requires the guitarist to use the entire weight of their forearm, fighting the brutal cutting tension of the steel. Stevie did this relentlessly for 3 hours a night, hundreds of nights a year. The massive strings produced a tone that was incredibly thick, bell-like, and resonant, but the biological cost to his hands was devastating. The heavy steel wire would routinely slice through the thick calluses on his fingertips. His skin would split open in the middle of a concert, exposing the raw nerve endings underneath. Blood would frequently spray across the pickguard of his guitar as his right hand struck the strings with violent downward chops. For most musicians, a split fingertip means canceling the show. For Stevie, it simply meant a change in protocol. He kept tubes of industrial superglue in his guitar case. When his fingers ripped open, he would step back to his amplifier, pour the toxic glue directly into the open, bleeding fissures of his skin, hold the flesh together until it dried into a hard synthetic shell, and walk back to the microphone to finish the set. This was not just an eccentric technical choice. It was a psychological manifestation of his need to struggle. He needed the guitar to fight back. If the instrument was too easy to play, it did not feel authentic. He had to bleed for the notes to believe they were real. The primary recipient of this abuse was a heavily modified, battered Fender Stratocaster he affectionately called Number 1 or his first wife. It was a patchwork instrument assembled from a 1963 body, a 1962 neck, and 1959 pickups. By the time Stevie was touring internationally, Number 1 looked like it had been dragged behind a truck. The sunburst finish was completely stripped away in large, ragged patches, exposing the raw, splintered alder wood beneath. It was gouged, scorched, and soaked in sweat and blood. Yet he treated that specific piece of wood with a reverence that bordered on the sacred. No one was allowed to handle the instrument except his trusted guitar technician, René Martinez. The guitar was a mirror. It was battered, exposed, and pushed to its absolute breaking point, exactly like the man playing it. But the physical pain of his torn fingers was ultimately manageable. It was the crushing, invisible weight of his own mind that required a different kind of intervention. The touring schedule implemented by his management and record label was punishing. The success of Texas Flood was quickly followed by the demands to record to Curd and Tour Couldn't Stand the Weather in 1984, and then Soul to Soul in 1985. The pressure was relentless. Stevie was entirely consumed by a deep-rooted imposter syndrome. He constantly feared that the world would suddenly wake up, realize he was just an uneducated kid from Texas, and take it all away. To cope with the crippling social anxiety of interviews, the exhaustion of the road, and the haunting memories of his father's violent home, he turned to the ubiquitous fuel of the 1980s music industry, cocaine. In the beginning, the drug was a functional tool. It provided a false sense of confidence and the artificial stamina needed to play a show at 2 a.m. after driving hundreds of miles. But addiction in a man with severe, unprocessed trauma does not remain functional for long. It rapidly devolves into a biological hostage situation. By 1985, Stevie Ray Vaughan's drug habit had escalated to a level that defied medical logic. At the zenith of his addiction, Stevie was consuming up to 7 grams of pure cocaine every single day. To put that into perspective, a fraction of that amount is enough to trigger cardiac arrest in a healthy adult. The cocaine sent his nervous system into a state of hyperarousal, causing severe paranoia and physical tremors. To counteract the crippling anxiety caused by the stimulant, he began drinking heavily. He consumed a full quart of Crown Royal whiskey daily. He was effectively playing a lethal game of chemical tug-of-war with his own heart, using the alcohol to pull himself down from the cocaine and the cocaine to shock himself awake from the alcohol. The physical deterioration was grotesque and undeniable. His weight plummeted. His face, once sharp and expressive, became sunken, gray, and haunted. The sheer volume of cocaine he was snorting completely destroyed the delicate tissues of his nasal passages. The corrosive chemical burned through his septum, eroding the cartilage until the structural integrity of his nose collapsed. It became physically agonizing and eventually impossible for him to snort the powder, but the addiction was absolute. Deprived of his nasal intake, Stevie resorted to a horrifying workaround. He began dumping the raw cocaine powder directly into his glasses of Crown Royal, stirring the narcotic into the liquor and drinking the lethal, corrosive mixture. His body was no longer a temple for his art. It was a rapidly decaying vessel, buckling under the strain of processing a daily intake of poison that would have killed a lesser man months earlier. The music industry, inherently parasitic, largely turned a blind eye. As long as he could stand up and play the guitar, the tour dates were booked, the tickets were sold, and the machinery kept grinding. Yes men surrounded him, enabling the addiction to keep the lucrative Double Trouble enterprise moving forward. But biology cannot be negotiated with, and the bill eventually came due. The catastrophic systemic failure occurred in September 1986. Double Trouble was in the midst of a grueling, chaotic European tour. The band members were exhausted, and Stevie was teetering on the edge of psychosis. During a performance in Ludwigshafen, Germany, the biological debt was finally called in. In the middle of the set, Stevie's body simply refused to continue. He collapsed onto the stage. He began to violently vomit blood and yellow bile, his internal organs rebelling against the years of chemical abuse. The crowd watched in horror as the Texas hurricane was carried off the stage, a frail, broken man entirely consumed by his own coping mechanisms. Despite the collapse, the machine tried to push him forward. He was transported to London to continue the tour. It was a fatal miscalculation. While trying to navigate the stage setup in London, his coordination, severely compromised by the neurological damage of the drugs, failed him. He stumbled and fell off a stage gangplank. The physical impact of the fall exacerbated his already dire medical condition, triggering severe internal hemorrhaging. He was rushed to a London hospital, bleeding internally, his body shutting down. In the sterile environment of the hospital, the sycophants and industry enablers were finally stripped away. Stevie was examined by Dr. Victor Bloom, a highly respected physician and leading addiction specialist in London. Dr. Bloom ran a battery of physiological tests on the 31-year-old guitarist. When the results came back, the doctor did not offer polite warnings or industry-standard coddling. He delivered a cold, clinical, and utterly terrifying reality check. Dr. Bloom stood at the foot of Stevie's hospital bed and explained the mechanics of what the drugs had done. The daily ingestion of cocaine mixed with high-proof whiskey had effectively burned the inside of his body. The lining of his stomach was rotting away. The cocaine had begun to crystallize in his intestines, creating severe blockages and internal bleeding. His liver was failing. His heart was severely enlarged. The doctor looked Stevie directly in the eye and delivered a clinical, terrifying ultimatum. If he did not immediately stop his current trajectory, his body would not survive another 2 weeks. For the first time in a decade, the thick, heavy fog of the cocaine was pierced by the sharp blade of absolute mortality. The illusion of invincibility shattered. The ego of the rock star evaporated, leaving only the terrified, exhausted boy from Dallas. Stevie Ray Vaughan lay in the hospital bed, thousands of miles from home, his body broken and his mind entirely fractured. He reached for the telephone. He did not call his management. He did not call his record label. He called his mother in Texas. When she answered the phone, Stevie broke down. The man who could command an arena of 50,000 people with a single bend of a guitar string wept like a child. Through the tears, his voice cracked as he delivered the ultimate surrender. "Mom," he sobbed, the heavy Texas drawl thick with exhaustion. "I'm so tired. I can't do this anymore. I want to come home." The tour was canceled immediately. The amplifiers were packed away in their road cases. The machinery of the music industry ground to a sudden, jarring halt. Stevie Ray Vaughan was flying back to the United States not as a conquering hero, but as a casualty of his own success, preparing to face an enemy far more terrifying than a violent father or a hostile crowd, a sober, silent room, alone with his own mind. In the fall of 1986, the heavy doors of the Charter Peachford Hospital in Atlanta locked behind Stevie Ray Vaughan. He did not enter alone. In a rare display of industry loyalty, his severely addicted bassist Tommy Shannon checked in beside him. The physical detox was brutal, a violent, bone-deep rebellion of a nervous system deprived of whiskey and cocaine. But the physical pain was trivial compared to the psychological terror that followed. For a decade, drugs had insulated Stevie from the lingering trauma of his father's violence and the crushing anxiety of the crowds. More importantly, he believed the chemicals fueled his art. Stripped of his amplifiers and his cocaine, Stevie sat in a sterile therapy room and voiced his paralyzing fear. If he got completely clean, would the music leave him? The music industry monetizes self-destruction, selling the lie that genius requires misery. Stevie had to choose between his life and the perceived source of his magic. He chose his life. He embraced his recovery with the same obsessive dedication he once used to learn Albert King's solos, taking absolute responsibility for his trauma and his healing. Weeks later, when a guitar was finally brought into the facility, his hands trembled. He struck a chord and bent a string. The sound rang out crisp, sharp, and exact. The profound realization hit him. The drugs had never been his muse. They had been a cage. The talent had always been in his hands, forged in his childhood bedroom. Sober, his connection to the instrument was razor sharp. He walked out of Charter Lane a free man. When Stevie announced he was recording his next album completely sober, cynical industry executives wondered if a healthy bluesman could still sell records. He answered them with In Step, 1989, a masterclass in modern guitar entirely devoid of the murky slop of his drug-fueled years. He stopped hiding. He co-wrote fiercely autobiographical tracks like Wall of Denial and Tightrope, laying his addiction bare. He delivered these lyrics not with the whine of a victim, but with the authority of a survivor. Winning a Grammy, the album silenced the skeptics and definitively shattered the myth of the tortured genius. By August 1990, Stevie was 35, healthy, and at the absolute peak of his powers. Double Trouble was booked to open for Eric Clapton's massive stadium tour, leading them to the Alpine Valley Music Theater in Wisconsin. On August 26, the two-day festival climaxed with a 20-minute jam of Sweet Home Chicago. Sharing the stage with Clapton, Buddy Guy, Robert Cray, and his brother Jimmy, Stevie took his solo. He didn't just play, he commanded the instrument with a furious, terrifying mastery. Clapton later confessed to being entirely paralyzed by what he witnessed. It was the sound of a man who had waged a brutal war against his own demons, defeated them, and was now celebrating his victory in front of 30,000 witnesses. At midnight, the amplifiers were turned off. Outside, a sudden, dense radiation fog swallowed the amphitheater, plummeting visibility to near zero and gridlocking the rural roads. Exhausted and eager to rest, Stevie was offered a single empty seat on one of the helicopters chartered for Clapton's crew. He hugged his brother Jimmy, boarded the Bell 206B Jet Ranger, and lifted off into an opaque white wall at 12:40 a.m. Disoriented by the fog, the pilot lost all visual reference to the horizon. Just seconds after takeoff, traveling at a high rate of speed, the helicopter slammed violently into a 300-foot ski hill. The catastrophic impact killed all 5 men on board instantaneously. Because there was no fire and the fog was so thick, no one at the venue heard the crash. The world kept moving, entirely unaware that the Texas hurricane had just been extinguished. It wasn't until the fog lifted at 7 a.m. that the shattered wreckage was found, leaving Eric Clapton and Jimmy Vaughan the devastating task of identifying the remains. The cruelty of fate is measured by its timing. The tragedy of Stevie Ray Vaughan is not simply that he died young. It is that he died exactly when he had figured out how to live. Yet he was robbed of his future only after his legacy was permanently cemented. Before 1983, the blues was an aging, marginalized genre. Stevie acted as a high-voltage defibrillator, shocking it back to life and dragging an entire generation of younger musicians out of the shadows. But his ultimate significance extends far beyond his technical prowess. His life is a blueprint for survival. He took the profound trauma of an abusive childhood and transmuted it into a sound of staggering power. He refused to be a casualty of his own success, proving that a clear mind is infinitely more powerful than an intoxicated one. Today, his battered #1 Stratocaster rests in silence, but the sound it made continues to echo. The helicopter crashed on the side of a Wisconsin hill, but the Texas hurricane never stopped blowing. He remains the immortal reminder that no matter how deep the trauma, no matter how thick the fog, the human spirit, when armed with truth and 6 strings, is entirely indestructible.